King Solomon talks about this. He talks about it in a different way. He says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Now, the heart to the Hebrew mind was your core self, your sense of identity, the person that you are, the feelings that you have about yourself. As a man thinks in his heart, in other words, the feelings that you have, your sense of identity, whether you are enough or not enough, is in your heart. That's the very core of who you are. She says, as a man thinks in his heart, as you now perceive yourself to be, that's the way you're going to live. And then he says, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it springs the issues of life. Now, the word here for issues, it means boundaries. It means limitations. So what is being said here? That the very limitations that you have upon your life is based on how you perceive yourself in your unconscious mind, in your heart, in the feelings about yourself determine the life you're going to live. So, for example, you may not go for a job. You may not pursue a job. Why don't you pursue a job? Well, because in your conscious mind, you say, I would like to get the job, but your unconscious mind, your heart says, I do not qualify, I'm not enough. Or, how many remember the first date you went on? Nobody remembers. That's a sad sign of our age. But if you kind of remember, how many remember what were you trying to do? You were trying to find someone that would love you, right? Are you with me on that part? You try to find someone to love you, and what do you have to do? You had to present yourself lovable to them. And many times we would kind of know instinctively the people that would accept us that we felt like we were enough for. But there were some people that we didn't feel like we were enough for. So we didn't pursue them. Are you kind of, you're all old, you don't remember this stuff? I mean, what I'm saying. So what I'm saying, it was driven by the unconscious mind, your heart, your sense of identity, the way you felt about yourself. Now, this is not something that is uncommon. The Bible talks about this. When I went through my spiritual crisis, one of the things that I decided to do was that, I said, I want to believe for the right reason. I don't want to believe just because I was raised in a home. I don't want to believe the Bible just because, somebody told me that I should believe the Bible. I want to know that there is a reason. I want to know that there is a reason why I'm believing in God. So I went through this spiritual crisis, and the way that I had always interpreted the Bible was like that the Bible was like this manual, like a constitution to follow. So if you wanted to have advice about how to live, you will go to and find the verse and the chapter, and then you kind of would find that, and you read that, and you say, that's for me. And then you would skip over all kinds of other verses, and you would just pick and choose, right? And if you didn't like someone, you would make sure you pick and choose all the stuff that you didn't like about yourself, and you would throw that to them. And so the Bible was really confusing. It became confusing to me because I even saw contradictions, and what appeared to be contradictions. I realized that the Bible is not necessarily what we think it is. The Bible is stories about God meeting people over a period of more than 2,000 years. It was written over a period of 2,000 years. If God wanted to write a manual, He could have just written a manual. But He chose to have people explain their interactions with God and talk about their experiences. And then they would present that. So He would meet people where, in other words, it was God meeting people where they were at. So, for example, Abraham, during the time of Abraham, everybody was killing their firstborn in order to appease God. That's just the way it was. And God comes around and says, oh, yes, here's your firstborn, kill him. No, He says, I want to provide another sacrifice. He had a better way. He was pulling people to a greater understanding of who He is, that God is love. Now, so we take the Bible and we're trying to understand God. We're trying to understand ourselves. But how can God communicate something so vast, something so big? I mean, most of us are not smart enough to understand God, or even ourselves. Let's face it, we're not. Would you agree with me? I mean, when you hear, have you ever read like a science book or anything like that, and your mind goes like, duh? Doesn't take long. I mean, most of us, when we hit the science channel, we flip to the next channel because we just can't stay there for too long because my mind is... And how many remember math classes? And all the, like all the different things, like rows of math that I'm totally lost. I have no clue. So how can you understand God that exists, who created the universe, this universe that is so enormous with so many galaxies, and it's just like it's a big place. How can we understand God? We're still discovering. Science is still discovering God. How can we understand God? I can barely understand my wife. I've been married to her for 30 years. In fact, it reminds me of a story I've heard about this guy who was talking to God, and he said, God was saying to him, I want to grant you any wish you want. And the man thought for a second. He said, well, he says, I've always been wanting to go to Hawaii, but I hate flying, and I don't like taking a boat. So God, could you build me a highway from San Diego to Hawaii? God thought for a second. He says, do you have any other requests? And he said, well, he said, I've always been trying to understand women. I never seem to be, being able to keep the women. They always tell me I'm insensitive, I'm not this, I'm not doing that. And so God, if there is a second request, it is this. Please help me understand women. And there was a pause in heaven for a period of time. And God said, do you want 2 or 4 lanes on that highway? My point, there is a point here. The point here is that how can we understand God? God is so complex, so God tells us stories. And in those stories, there are clues that we can then begin to interpret, understand ourselves, and understand Him, the vastness of who He is. So one of the stories that I like to share, that I've shared many times, is in my book, Unravel Love's Mystery. It's a story about creation, about these 2 first people, Adam and Eve. Now, Adam and Eve, we think of it as this literal story that took place, and with snakes talking and all kinds of different things. And maybe it's literal, but maybe it's not. It doesn't matter. To me, it doesn't matter. What matters is there is a story within that story. There is a truth in there that we glean from, that we learn something about humanity. Where this root of insecurity began, where this root of I am not enough began. And so we read this story about Adam and Eve, and Adam simply means human. It means man. And Eve means the source of life. And we read about Adam and Eve that they were both naked. I mean, and the Bible says they were not ashamed. The book of Genesis says they were not ashamed. They were naked and they were not ashamed. Now, the word shame means there is something wrong with me, a feeling that there is something wrong with me. In other words, there's this feeling that I'm not enough. It's an insecurity, that there is something missing in my life. So they did not have that. So it didn't matter whether they had hairy legs or they had, big bushy eyebrows, or if their midsection looked like a sumo wrestler. It didn't make any difference. They didn't care because they didn't know. They were not self-aware. How many see this? They were naked. They didn't know what was wrong with it. There was no sense of shame. And so then there were 2 trees. There were many trees. And trees can be symbolic of many things. You read that in the book of Genesis and many of our other books. You read that trees were symbolic of people. Now, when you eat the fruit of a tree, what are you doing? You are ingesting, or you are partaking of the very seed that now will create another tree. So if you eat the tree, and if you plant that tree in the ground, what will happen? Another tree will grow up, right? And so so it's symbolic of eating a life, eating an operating system, eating something that will now decide the way you're going to live. So they took of this tree called the knowledge of good and evil in order to be like God. Now understand this. They were already with God, in God. God is in all things. They were created in the image of God. The word image to them was not like, oh, we are like Him, but we're not like Him. No, it was that God's creation, that God expressed Himself in His creation. He expressed Himself through man. So they were already in God. God was in them. He was with them. He was for them. But they gained and they ate of this knowledge of good and evil to become like God. And Genesis says that the day that they would eat of it, they would surely die. Now, the word here for surely means die. So it means die, die. They would die, die. What does that mean? Well, it simply means that they would die. But they didn't die physically. They lived hundreds and hundreds of years longer than that. So how did they die? Well, the word death means separation. Death means separation. It means that on the day they ate of the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, they now were separated in their mind. Their mind caused a separation because they were still in God. God is still everywhere, right? They were separated from being consciously aware of God and being accepted in God and being loved by God. That's what happened. So they gained this system that was based on good and evil. In order for me now to get to God, God is there somewhere. I am here, rather than Him being in me. He is there somewhere. In order for me to get to Him, I got to be good and avoid evil. The world of self was created. And then it says in the book of Genesis, it says that they became afraid. And they hid themselves. And they put a covering over themselves. They covered their nakedness. They covered their shame. See, fear always has to present an alternate self. It has to present a self that is acceptable, because no longer did they feel that they were enough. In that Garden of Eden, when they ate of that tree, the basic problem or the end problem was that they didn't see themselves as being enough.